All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. And thanks again for bearing with us through these technical challenges and fun times. And thanks so much again to Tom for setting up the Zoom. I am very pleased to introduce Caroline Blaker of Aquarian Web Studio. She is such a great contributor to the Expression Engine community, and we're always thrilled to be able to learn from her and pick up some tips. And she's going to talk to us about these, everything about GA4 and what we need to know, and how we can get this annoying alert that everybody's getting off our Google Analytics dashboards. So without further ado, here is Caroline. I'll let her take it away.
Thank you, Lydia. Can everybody hear me? And can someone say if everyone's saying yes, because I can't see any chats right now. Let me see if I can. Oh, here we go. Got you, says Doug. All right. Yeah, thanks, Robert. Thanks, Oliver. All right, I'm going to put this little window right here just in case it ends up being something I want to check into later. But hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk. This is Let's Talk GA4, or its alternate title, The Missing Manual. As we're all perhaps aware, our old friend, Universal Analytics, or what we think of as Google Analytics just generally, is going down. Free accounts will stop processing data on July 1st. No promised access to the platform after that time. Paid accounts have a little longer, but not forever. This was going to be a blank slide pretty much, but as I accessed Universal Analytics last week, I got this here countdown clock. I mean, they're getting really serious right now. You have a little over a month at this point to move stuff over. But if you're like me and you like to compare year-over-year data, you're probably aware that at this point, you're like 10 months in the arrears to grab that, because it's not going to start registering year-over-year until the day you install a year from now. So about me a little bit. I'm Caroline Blaker. This is my 4th Expression Engine conference presentation. It's my first technical one that actually involves code, which is exciting, but we're not going to do any live coding today. I don't have a dummy account. All of the screens you're about to see come from real world Google Analytics 4 client accounts. And since this talk is going to be haunting YouTube for a while, or I think it will be, I did what I could to anonymize what we would be looking at and keeping it in context. My company, Aquarian Web Studio, has been setting up Google Analytics 4 since last summer. We have the great privilege of being on a collaborative team with a client that keeps us busy with optimization work and CRO, which is conversion retention optimization, SEO or search engine optimization, you've all heard of that, and as well as A/B testing. Our role in this relationship is to implement the changes these experts provide, changes that are reviewed in detail at least twice a month, explained top to bottom, and left off with us for implementation. The window into this kind of web study practice has left us with the confidence to take on our own practice of SEO with light CRO, and of course, Google Analytics 4 implementation. The screens you're about to see, they're not from shared client, from that shared client, but another source we've set up independently. This is an SEO client who's relied on us for over 2 years. So who's taught us everything we know? This amazing organization, I hear you asking. The company is InFlow out of Denver. This presentation is in part based on a webinar hosted by Google and put on by InFlow, featuring Julia and Mike for their clients and associates. It was jam-packed with what felt like acclimating details. And even though I had already agreed to take this on when I attended it, there was just so much in it that I'd never even heard of. Like, I couldn't even keep up with my notes. I've had to access the webinar since and like play it back in the tiniest of increments to help me prepare for this. So big thanks to InFlow for including us as guests in that webinar. If you're interested in learning more about InFlow and how InFlow can help you, you can scan the QR code from your phone if you're just sitting there. Or if you're on your phone already and you can't scan your phone with your phone, you can just go to inflow.com at your next convenience, or check the link in the description below. So the reason we're here today is because we're being asked to switch completely away from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4. And that's just entirely unreasonable because they're not at all the same thing. They don't measure the same things, they don't count the same, and they don't report the same. Yet one is supposed to replace the other and we're just supposed to like run along with it. I mean, truly an opportunity has been missed by Google not explaining what they did, why they did it, what it is, or how it's used to the greater public. Some time ago, when I felt like I had a baseline understanding of what's going on, thanks to these monthly private meetings, I kind of went, well, at least I'm caught up. And I wondered what y'all would do to train yourselves and figure this out. At the same time, I was grateful I didn't have to do any of that looking around, but I didn't make any material around it until just now. While the docs are fairly complete for adding small bits of code and using words that coincide with the GA4 control panel, very little is provided for context, reasoning, relationships between things, or conventions to follow in order to find either your old priority reports or to discover new priorities in the system. But let's start with our old friend. Universal Analytics, our old friend, was launched in 2012. And it may or may not surprise you that the conventions of the day prevailed over its development and releases, if releases were even a thing. And that includes like prevailing opinions, conventions, patterns. It was in the earliest days of concerns around privacy, usability. I mean, it was 4 years after web fonts started. We were barely past the punch the monkey ads and the polyphonic ringtones. The internet being contained to your phone was imaginary, but it was being imagined and implemented. User tracking was being looked at from a session standpoint, an IP address standpoint, and an all sessions end at midnight standpoint. Yeah, did you know that sessions that go through midnight on Universal Analytics are recorded in duplicate for both days from the docs? If a session crosses a day boundary, example given, if it starts at 11:55 p.m. and ends at 12:05 a.m., it's considered a single session, though it is counted once for each day. More on sessions in just a little bit. Universal Analytics, though, was the tool for its time. The parlance around keeping people engaged, interested, and in a good relationship with the brand through the website always hovered around common conventions like bounce rate, which is a measure of loss, and page views are here, the meaningful event within the session that showed interest. Conversions here sit kind of like a finish line. Did you know that Universal Analytics stopped measuring goals and conversions after one trigger? So if a person converted or completed a goal, this platform considered them sort of finished whatever they were there to do. Which tells me that even the most forward-thinking models around analytics and measurement was this linear sense of start to finish, transactional web use. And Universal Analytics still does this. It hasn't been updated or corrected in any particular way. So here it is, our new screen, right? Here's our new screen on Google Analytics 4. We're measuring user acquisition. This is a focus on new users, whereas the last screen we saw had a column for new users next to traffic, which GA4 also gives its own focus page. You can see that there under the blue highlighted navigation. I put it to the right of the page. It's called traffic acquisition. And while none of these columns is named the same as the other page we just looked at, and other details like color and graph shape have been rebased, this is actually measuring extremely similar things based on new conventions reflecting perspective shifts into today's online marketing demands. This is a really good place to point out where some of the rubber hits the road, and to show you where a shift in perspective has led to a new measured convention. For instance, we go right from new users, and instead of putting sessions right there, we have engaged sessions. I mean, it's like so small, blink and you'll miss it, but check this out. First of all, engaged sessions is an entirely new metric. And on further examination, bounce rate is completely missing. These are related. Julia says the engagement rate is the percent of sessions that are engaged. An engaged session has to last longer than 10 seconds or contain 2 page views or have a conversion event. And so the engaged sessions column is the number of sessions by new users that were engaged. If you still need that bounce rate, you can use the inverse of the rate of engaged sessions, which is the new definition of the bounce rate. The old one was a bounce is a single page session on your site. In analytics, a bounce is calculated specifically as a session that triggers only a single request to the analytics server. And the rate, of course, for that would be the rate at which that happened. So this definition is a page-based definition, whereas the new definition, essentially a not engaged session, qualifies by having only 1 page view, but also lasting less than 10 seconds and absolutely not triggering a conversion event. As an aside, I wonder how many people would agree with me that this means that Google thinks that a website has exactly 10 seconds to grab a user's attention. If they've gone ahead and drawn parameters around this based on 10 seconds, it just occurs to me that maybe that's what they're thinking. Anyway, here we are measuring engagement from a few different directions. Word to the wise. If you're not seeing those revenue or conversion columns in that where I sort of have something grayed out, and you set those up, be sure you scroll the table in page to the right or to the right. I don't know which way is right for you. If you're looking at too narrow a window, these columns tend to get hidden inside and there isn't a lot of indication of a scroll. You can also see a deferral to a whole other page to deal with sessions as their own topic, as opposed to being in the column next door. If you've ever compared users to sessions and you've gotten something out of it, drop it in the YouTube comments or in the chat. But it's almost as though the platform recognizes that comparing new users and anything that happens between that and an engaged session may not really matter. Has no particular meaning, may ultimately mean something if the user turns back up and does engage. But here we are measuring sessions by default channel group. And it says this twice on the page, once prominently at the headline and another one that's like tiny and grayed out in the middle of the page right there below the search bar. It's like this grayed out text. But before I get to that, I want to show you the new default channel groups in GA4. Default channel groups in GA4 have expanded to this mighty list here. Here we are catching some old favorites and some brand new ones. The top QR code leads to the official GA4 docs on this default channel group page. So there you will find definitions and descriptions separately. You can also create custom channel groups, which I haven't done. You can change the name of those channels to topic names and bundle a handful of referrers and setups and campaigns in there. And the second QR code here will lead you to the documentation on that. So back to our new user screen and making adjustments to where we're comparing. Just ignore for a second that we can barely see this, that tiny gray text that was in its inactive state, but that's actually a menu that throws up this entire window here. Those new conventions, they appear to favor simplicity over energetic control panels that assume they can read your mind and lead you to where things are. We've got a lot of options here dedicated to first-time users. You can see that they have all been renamed along those lines, and some strangers are here, but this is just the new version of the 4-option dropdown in Universal Analytics. Let's choose source medium for old time's sake. And so now this information has taken on a whole new organizational structure to review it from. There's no filter by goal, though. The most basic reason for this is that goals are no longer a thing. You don't set up goals anymore. You set up events and conversions. Everyone with me so far? It's important to note that fundamentally goals have been shifted into events, and that conversions are a subset of events that do something essential for the business, like ring a sale or join a mailing list. Scrolls, clicks, navigation, and yes, even the formerly coveted page view have been relegated to events. Use the QR code or the link provided to the description to explore what GA4 will have set up for you already. It's difficult to understate just how much this changes what you're looking at with your analytics. Firstly, Universal Analytics goals had very limited scope. In Universal Analytics, a goal tracks exactly once per session. It was for that reason that you had to set up goals like click 1 and click 2 in order to get a user story out of your setup. Furthermore, it's difficult to understand just how much this changes what you're looking at with your analytics. What's going on? Everybody with me so far? Okay. It was a done deal when you converted the session in Universal Analytics. I mean, very 2012 linear thinking. You couldn't write this for today's demands and get off the ground. So where I'm going is Google Analytics 4 measures all events and conversions in a session. Quick poll, how many people think these reports are going to look the same as Universal Analytics? Have the same counts, even count the same things? They will almost never line up. And in some cases will be completely unreconcilable. There are additional reasons for this too. Google Analytics 4 is focused on being GDPR compliant, but that's a tall order and it'll take a lot of time. And in the meantime, one of the mandates for GDPR is that the browser settings be in control of tracking, and that the browser actually have that authority to cut off the tracking if the user redacts the permission. So if any of your users are browsing with strict privacy settings, Google Analytics 4 isn't going to track them. Some of you may be doing this to every website you visit. Speaking of sessions, the session doesn't end until 30 minutes of inactivity. It starts when a user either opens up your app in the foreground or views a page or screen and no session is currently active. One thing Google Analytics 4 really has going for it is the use of Google Signals sessions, which do a lot more to accurately expand the picture of a session over the duration of a user's entire intent to interact with your website. As a Google user, and I'm assuming you are, you're consented to Google on some level. As you stay logged in across devices, Google has naturally figured out how to follow you from thing to thing. Your aggregated record of preferences follows you around, sort of hidden from immediate view. It does get used to put checks in certain columns in GA4 where the user has technically consented to do so. If a session ID is created for you, then your session is tracked. The information present in your session ID is likely this huge, very proprietary structure. And traffic is counted from the number of session IDs and thusly session objects present within a time frame. The session likely feeds your aggregated record, and your aggregated record likely adds age and gender type information to the session, whatever you've consented to give. So when you move from your phone to your computer to buy something, it can also track a session through changes in campaign source. So maybe on the phone, it was an ad click, and on the computer at home, after clearing it with your finances, it's a brand name search. You don't need that original ad to get that to that product anymore. So Google Signals weighs this as the same session, assuming there hasn't been 30 minutes of downtime in between them. This aggregate knowledge of you that Google collects is known as Google Signals, and the amount of it you want to track for reporting purposes is in your analytics is actually configurable. So Google Analytics 4 will allow you to make the most of Google Signals here or allow you to bypass it entirely. in the reporting identity screen in the administrative section, you have these three options. Blended carries the most certainty in user stories. Observed has a lot less information to work with than blended, and device-based appears to be left out of Google Signals altogether. So for the richest user story, blended's your choice. For a more classic tracking, choose device-based. Choosing device-based is also rumored to help clear up any data throttling that Google might impose on very large accounts. It's important to notate that you can't toggle these and read your reports differently. You have to set this and forget it. This setting goes into how your data is determined to be your data and doesn't go back and rewrite your data in order to implement this. It implements it going forward. If you need this to be set differently to measure different things for different outcomes, just create a new property for each use case. Attribution is also configurable per property in the same way. Definitely have a look here if you feel that ad counts might be off. This is another set it and forget it setting, so keep properties separate for measuring different things based on these settings. Better yet, separating properties into individual concerns and setting these both reporting identity and attribution models will allow you to get the information you want for both perspectives. The audiences feature is amazing, in my opinion. When you make an audience and select it here, you are routed to standard reporting screens limited to that defined audience. So to study a certain cohort of people, you don't need to use exploration reports. You can configure an audience and have your standard screens. While we're at it, the panel to the right shows creating a new audience where you get starting points under general and templates. But then there's also this AI predictive tab that has a whole list of AI audiences to study. None of them are available to my client, but they might be available to yours. Which brings me to this question that someone had. How do you show file name and more for downloaded files, which are being tracked by default as a page event? You can set these up as a conversion if you want, if that is what, if it rises to that level with your business. But we're still in the admin panel here, but we're looking at custom definitions, which means nothing unless you know what it's for. Well, it's for creating reporting options that you want to see in standard reports. Once you set up your custom definition of file name, it will be available to standard reports to show in your reporting tables going forward. And I implemented this for this presentation, but my client gets like 3 downloads a year. So I didn't have any really good like showing it going all the way through. So sorry about that. So I've already mentioned that any event counts as an engagement. We have a lot of default events ready to go. A few intelligent ones that require setup, and I'll run you through that. And then you can set up custom ones, of course. You might even want to mark an event as a conversion, and you would do that here. Let's take a look at the purchase event. So here I've clicked create event, and it's showing me what I've already created and giving me the chance to do it again. You definitely don't need to create most of the events GA4 provides, but anything that you want to limit to certain areas or absorb page data from, you need to create. So here's my purchase event that I've already created. I have a limiting matching condition in case stray purchases come through off of other pages, which I don't expect. And I've used the parameters to pick up data that's being passed with the event. Note the very specific syntax in the parameter and value fields. The code that feeds this is on the next slide. What I want you to notice is that adding the transaction ID is what makes a purchase unique, Google's rules, not mine. And for some reason, you have to notate the item loop separately like this. Even though the syntax isn't purported to be configurable, it still asks you to name items and point them out in your object. Referring to our code, this one is right out of the documentation crossed with Cartthrob. And honestly, this audience is so good at implementation, and Google really does have a lot on the docs covering these objects. But quickly reviewing the last slide, we use transaction ID and items to add to our event. Adding the transaction ID makes the event unique, and I'm not sure why adding ecommerce.items was necessary, but it was. All the rest of these properties just sort of automatically go along and are perfectly contexted just as they are. That is, unless you have a typo that misspells something critical, or if you leave out a comma and your JavaScript just breaks. All the rest of this object is sought out and contextualized without additional intervention. So again, if you don't use these parameter names exactly, the values won't be tracked. One last thing. If you can see the first line of this e-commerce object is US dollars. Well, not the first line, maybe line 6 or 7, but the first like internal line of the e-commerce object. If you're tracking purchases, but the values stay blank, you absolutely need to add a currency indicator. We added ours here. It can also be added to the object in Google Tag Manager or to the previous screen that I showed you as a static value, if that's your thing. Now, we've just looked at the data layer that pushes this purchase event to our analytics, but this isn't the last step. If you have your Google Analytics 4 set up through Google Tag Manager, which I recommend, you will need to set up the event to fire in the Google Tag Manager sphere because it actually stands between your website and your analytics. And it'll make your life easier if you're already set up here for universal analytics or ad tracking or any sort of third-party service. This particular visual reference is the Google Tag Manager event that fires a purchase in my Google Analytics 4 setup. I've added every bit of on-page object to this event, and it is fired by a trigger, which I've also set up. So as you can see here, I have a purchase trigger set up in my Google Tag Manager that triggers multiple instances of conversion tracking, of which our Google Analytics 4 install is just one. This ensures a drier setup and continuity with your tags and events. As I've already said, even though it's an extra step to set up, Google Tag Manager is the most professional setup for Google Analytics 4. You can have a busy bee marketing team that's always changing and adjusting site tags while production stays the same. Furthermore, it's version controlled. So you're keeping your marketing tag versioning separate from your code versioning. I like the separate versioning for separate concerns. Last but not least, you will never ever have to tank production with the excuse of changes to tracking. Now, I want to show you something that will likely annoy you and maybe confuse you. Maybe the slide will be helpful, but I want you to witness on one slide just how many times these variables are referenced and all, it seems, in different format and notation. Getting tripped up by this is incredibly annoying, and it can be overwhelming or downright show-stopping to not have a continuity of form between these platforms. Because if you don't get these exactly right, your values won't track and you'll be debugging it. Also on this slide, I want to point out that the Google Analytics 4 values are object notation. JavaScript expression engine is the object itself, and the intermediary Google Tag Manager somehow uses this impartial double curly brace notation and manages not to obscure the object or its values. It only makes sense to me in the context of Google Tag Manager being the oldest tool on the screen, but still, this is one of those where I can only point it out because it annoys me and I can't make it make sense. So since I've just described the multi-step process getting Google Analytics 4 fired up with Google Tag Manager, here's a slide redetailing that in a suggested order. Get your Google Tag Manager set up if you haven't already, and get any user data into the proper data layer event tag. Then create your purchase event in Google Tag Manager, have a trigger ready or create one. Then add your Google Analytics 4 event by adding a custom event or modifying an existing one. And then I think you still have to give it 24 hours. Check your reports if you're not dizzy to see what's tracking. So reporting. Now that we've reached reporting, we have a lot of background on setup, on what changed from Universal Analytics, what metrics we may have to shift into new territory like engagement rate and the anti-bounce rate, and what do you have to set up specifically and what do you not have to set up, and with that, what are you actually measuring? Reports are 3 categories: standard, which is what you're probably used to, exploration, which are interactive and quite click intensive, and advertising, which is where all the conversion path reporting is, regardless of whether or not you actually advertise. When you go to Universal Analytics from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4, gosh, there's so many words. One thing to keep in mind is that I've already touched on is that all events are considered engagement now, and page views is no longer any kind of gold standard engagement. That and Google Analytics 4 will not stop measuring measuring one of everything. It will collect all the engagement data in the session. I feel like we could spend weeks on just the reports in Google Analytics 4. And since it's such a big topic and I'm using real data, I just wanted to show you a mechanical change from Universal Analytics. Look for small menus that appear to be slightly grayed out and allow for secondary dimensions, demographic parceling, and more. They're really, really quite hidden, and they're not, and I'm not sure what I would have decided to do as a designer, but it felt very much like the thing I wanted to click was the thing that I could see the least. Exploration reports are a lot. There's a certain amount of fluency required around a puddle of marketing words that are often used in close proximity without a lot of relative definition. Don't feel bad if this is overwhelming. Here, without using video, I'm making a small effort to show you what happens when I click that 3rd column on the view item event, and I get the 4th step. There are a ton of random user segments visible here. I can add many, many different types of segmentation, or I can add one segment for all users. My node type selections on the double left-hand side menu are the selections I get if I click event name in the writer of the 2 left-hand side columns. That all drops down. The dimensions selected go into the breakdown menu. You should know that if your website has so much data that your account is throttled, exploration reports may be the first feature affected by that. What I like about these is that they're great for spotting trends and for finding what you need to study. But once you know what to study, standard reporting is still going to give you more specifics. Just because I know you're curious, here's the conversion paths report I've referenced. I personally have very little use for it. Like I'm supposed to be able to decode the significance of different organic search types here. Switching the main left column type doesn't really help contextualize this at all. What you could be looking for here is an anomalous like day count to conversion, touch point count, and of course, advertising channels that would like sort of stuff in here comparing with the stuff that I've shown here that isn't advertising. So hopefully I've been able to convey here just where our perspective on Google Analytics has to shift in order to embrace this new tool replacement for Universal Analytics. Hopefully I've also conveyed why creating this new tool and not simply updating Universal Analytics may have been the cleaner path for Google to align with so many moving parts in today's webscape. The privacy, the attribution, the reporting identity, the consent. Are we GDPR compliant? I think it's trying to be, but that's a big exchange with 2 big powers. And at this point, I can imagine them being quite tired of each other. Either way, Google Analytics 4 has made huge improvements on accuracy from Universal Analytics, especially with the flexible setup. And so if I were you, I would never expect numbers to line up. with Universal Analytics or Fathom or even your content management system. And that's it for today. I hope it's been helpful. If I haven't gotten to your question, or if you have a point of clarification, or if this stuff moves around in the future and looks different, please feel free to make use of the YouTube comments to post an update or ask a question. And along those lines, if you're watching this on replay and you've learned something today, hit that like button and share it with anybody that you feel may have a need for similar kind of information. You can find me on multiple platforms with these handles, or use the QR code to visit Aquarian Web Studio to learn more about consulting with us or working with us. If all of this just feels too big, we'd love to take a look. And of course, big thanks to InFlow for their ongoing expertise and the advice, and big thanks to EEConf for having me present again for the 4th time. Any questions?
Caroline, we've got a question in from Jess on, do you see anything wrong with running both UA and GA4 for now?
Yes, I have seen. So it's super tricky to get that to work. If you don't actually use Google's workflow that allows you to migrate your Universal Analytics account to GA4, you end up tracking twice in some areas because the two don't mutually exclude. If you have two types of tracking code, one will track, then the other one will track, but then you have sort of like these data layer inconsistencies where you can get, where some things won't be erased. We are running Universal Analytics and Google Analytics 4 together on pretty much all of our accounts. It has introduced a level of complexity that almost nobody is ready to answer questions on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, we're just not sure, since that it is tracking different things. And I don't know if our end users are ready to make the big switch yet. So I was kind of hoping that we could do both at the same time to get them used to it. But
and yeah, I'm looking for my chat window here. It's tricky. I have conversions. I have like blank conversions tracking twice that I have to hide, and and it's really hard to tell when you do that if you have anomalies. If it's Google Analytics 4 being a weird newbie on the scene, or if it's like something you've introduced, there's just no way to debug it. So like travel carefully, travel lightly, like whatever it is. But just, you're always just doing the best for your client. And this is not one of those places where they've tried to make it easier, but the complexity doesn't make it, there's just no way to make easy on this level of complexity. There just isn't. And it's all in their house. Like, we don't get access to where the errors are or what we're doing wrong or anything like that. There is debug mode for GA4. I haven't covered it in this talk. I don't know if even Universal Analytics would play into that. It shouldn't. But again, here we are talking about several hours worth of just going in there and seeing what's up.
that makes sense. Thank you.
Of course.
Caroline, we have a question from Doug. How have you helped clients move in their understanding of this change, especially around their navigation of reporting?
So what I've done is I haven't had to do a lot of the explaining, but I'm going to keep little bits of this information. If I were to do this tomorrow, for instance, I would point out where the standards have changed. I would talk about engaged sessions with them and how it's a brand new metric, and how the platform is really meant to sort of be seen as like a bucket carrying water versus focusing on things that are measures of loss. I would say that now everything is sort of a page view, or page views have been relegated to everything else. There's no sort of exalted, this counts as interaction event. They all count. So it's sort of, what you can tell your client is, like, I would base it entirely on what they're actually hiring for. Like, we can track more sales of XYZ, or we can see if this page is ineffective because people have to scroll too far, or, you know, things like that are now like, you don't have to set up multiple goals to get those kinds of stories. You can pretty much just get into your, if you have a self-directed thing to measure, you pretty much get in there and not set anything up. Getting to what you're actually measuring, though, is its own sort of art and practice. As you know, measuring in Google Analytics is its own job, its own specialty. What else do we have?
Oliver wants to know, is a basic level stats screen for, let's see, is a basic level stats screen for Stream basic users, clients he's talking about.
Are you talking about like page counts, like going back to just not having events and just screening for page views and that kind of stuff? I thought about doing this last night. I was like, I should do a nightmare scenario where you have to like pare down Google Analytics 4 to get it to be like Universal Analytics the most. And I'm like, oh, well, that's probably like its own talk. You can filter your event where it says all events in your columns. You can filter for just page views. And then when you're using exploration screens, you can use the page view. And if you want, we can have a little meeting and I'll help you set that up.
Okay, we have another question in about the Universal. Should we be downloading all past Universal reports to archive?
Yes, if your business or your client is going to be comparing year over year from multiple years in order to prove some major thing to some major party. Otherwise, not really. Year over year, not having that is why people started talking about moving people over last year. Like you have a year, but only a year to get that year over year. So you have, like when they announced that, we had like 2 weeks. Like I think we got our first account up in 3 weeks. In the 3-week window, they lost like a week of year over year data. If you think you'll reference it, then yes. Otherwise, for the most part, I've noticed a pattern where a lot of clients who are really intensive on their tracking will hire an SEO company to do monthly reports. And those reports are, you know, probably contain all of the good stuff that you need to sort of keep present or historically active. And the old calculations and the midnight sessions can just be ditched, you know, you don't really need to deal with that anymore. Oliver, that's interesting. Oliver says, I think most clients just want to know, A, how many views, visits, how many sales conversions from clicks. That's fine. And that reflects like a very historical sort of perspective on what goes on the internet. And I'm not saying you should change that for them, but there's probably some kind of report format that you can develop that answers those questions. What else do we have?
Caroline, speaking of other, you were kind of like, you know, SEO, you were just talking about SEO reporting and stuff. Do you know much about like, we have a lot of clients that use additional tools that like integrate with Google Analytics, like SEMrush or Ahrefs or Moz or some of those things. Are they all compatible with the new Google? Are they ready for it? I haven't really seen any mention of any of that. And do you happen to know?
So my impression overall is that the insertion point for those kinds of technologies to get your to get the intelligence is through webmaster tools. So a lot of times those will integrate with webmaster tools, and that is not going away or being changed in any direction in the immediate future. If it's actually there are some like Shopify concerns where they don't actually output Google Analytics 4 data to the page. I haven't been updated on that in a long time, so it might be cleared at this point. It would really depend on the platform, and if it's not integrated at the webmaster tools level, it's probably an on-page display that's the problem. It's probably it getting your code to the page where the user is. Otherwise, I'm not really sure how to answer or what those integrations are made of.
Okay, no worries. I was just kind of curious. We got another question in from Blair, basically asking, do you think Google Analytics is better addressing and competing features found in other paid products like Full Story and Hotjar?
Well, it doesn't have heat maps, but if you're after like the kind of, you would have to compare specifically the platform that you'd like to replace and see if you can put the Google Analytics 4 stuff into those kinds of formats. Without having used Full Story and without having logged into Hotjar in a few years, like I don't really know. It would be, I think, a matter of specifics that you would need to share with your clients, which I'm not aware of.
And we have another question from Travis. You mentioned a limit of use based on high traffic. Do you know the details on that?
Good question, Travis. I don't have any accounts that are highly enough trafficked to invoke the dreaded throttling, but it does exist. And I don't think it exists beyond unpaid accounts. So this is like a free-to-free switch in which, you might be throttled. Yes, in order to avoid throttling, you need to, there are a couple things. You can switch your reporting identity to device-based, which is not ideal in some situations. You can, but additionally, if throttling is a problem and you need exact counts, you can import your data to a Google service called BigQuery, which is not free, and it has very AWS vibes to it. It's like it charges like 5 cents like a terabyte per minute. Like really obscure pricing models in around lots and lots of volume math. So I haven't really gotten into BigQuery. I haven't needed to get into BigQuery, but BigQuery will store your entire data object, and then you connect Google Analytics 4 to that, and you will not be throttled. You can also export that data to other things that take it, and basically there's a GA4 API. And you can allow other viewing tools to absorb your data and crunch it for you. And yeah, none of it's free. Should go without saying. Okay, cool. Let me know if there's other questions. It's pretty quiet in here. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Caroline. It's just so informative. I'm sure we could have kept you on here for the entire day asking you questions about this. And so, she's let you guys know how to get in touch with her. She's always very, just so generous with her time with the community. And so thank you very much for this very informative this very informative talk that we can all go and explain to our clients. And now we have about 10 minutes until our next talk from Jenica. And So you guys can go hang out in the sessions. You can just, oh no, we can't, sorry, we're on Zoom. We can't hang out in the sessions. We can hang out here, show your faces, communicate or just chat. So thanks very much. We have about 10 minutes and we'll be back on for the next talk.